Right. So today we're going to dive into something pretty crucial for anyone, especially if you're getting ready for those UPSC exams.
Okay.
We're talking multi-level governance.
Right.
Now, it might sound a little dry at first, but trust me, this is a big deal for understanding how the world actually works these days. And for those of you who just love, you know, kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of global affairs, this is for you too.
Absolutely.
So this deep dive is based on really a core political science text that lays out the whole foundation of this idea.
Yeah. What's really interesting about this is that it challenges this idea that everything happens within national borders.
Right.
You know, we live in a world where decisions are made and power is exercised at so many different levels. It's global, it's regional, national, and even local. All these things are pushing and pulling at the same time.
Okay, so let's break this down a little bit.
Sure.
The text starts by talking about this shift from talking about government to talking about governance.
Right.
What's the distinction there, and why should we care?
Well, you know, it's subtle, but it signals a really huge change in how we think about power.
Okay.
You see, government usually makes you think of like these formal institutions, parliaments, Congress, ministries.
Okay.
And usually that's happening on that national level.
Okay.
But when we talk about governance, it's so much broader.
Okay.
It recognizes that in our really interconnected world that influencing what happens involves a whole bunch of actors. International organizations, corporations, even grassroots movements, all these things.
So it's like the old top-down model of government just can't keep up with a world that's just so much more interconnected now.
Think about the rise of globalization.
Right.
The internet, instant communication.
Yeah.
It creates a world where those challenges and opportunities can't just be contained within national borders.
Right.
Take climate change, for instance.
Yeah, good example.
It's a global problem that requires international cooperation.
Absolutely.
No single government can tackle it alone.
Right. And the source material, you know, it doesn't just talk about this abstractly.
Right.
Give some really vivid examples to illustrate this shift. It talks about the fiscal crisis of the state back in the 1970s, where governments, particularly in developed countries, they found themselves overextended, unable to deliver on all those promises of the welfare state.
And that really exposed the limitations of these big government approaches. And then came that rise of neoliberal ideology. Think Reagan, Thatcher.
Right.
This idea that free markets and smaller government were the answer.
Right.
So you have these forces, economic pressure, ideological shifts, this changing world, all pushing towards a more decentralized and flexible approach to governing.
So enter multi-level governance.
Exactly.
But what does that actually look like?
All right.
I love how the text uses this image of policymaking being both sucked up and drawn down. Almost like this tug of war.
Yeah, it's a great way to visualize it on the sucked up side.
Okay.
Think about those global issues like international trade or financial regulations, decisions made at the international level.
Right.
The WTO, the IMF.
Yeah.
These institutions have a huge impact on countries.
Absolutely.
Even if they don't agree with everything.
Right. The European Union is a classic example of this, right?
Exactly.
It's a supranational body.
Yeah.
That creates laws and regulations that all member states have to abide by.
Right.
Even if those laws clash with certain national interests.
Exactly.
But here's where I think it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
So at the same time, that globalization is sucking up decision-making power to these higher levels.
Right.
There's also this trend towards decentralization, which the text calls drawing down power.
Right.
So it's not just a one-way street.
It's not a one-way street.
Wait, so it's a two-way street.
Yeah.
Things are becoming more localized at the same time as they're becoming more globalized?
Yeah.
How does that even work?
Well, that's the beauty of this.
Yeah.
It embraces that complexity.
Okay.
There's so many things that drive decentralization.
Okay.
The rise of identity politics, regional autonomy movements, and even religious or anti-capitalist movements, rediscovering the power of local action.
So it seems counterintuitive, but it's happening all around us. It definitely makes you realize that the world isn't as simple as we sometimes assume.
No.
I mean, you've got the push for independence in Scotland, the demands for greater autonomy in Catalonia, and even within India, the dynamics of federalism with states having significant power. These are all expressions of local identities and interests.
Absolutely. And it's not just about separatism or nationalism. There's also this growing recognition that a lot of issues, like poverty or environmental protection, can best be tackled at the local level. Communities often have a better understanding of their own needs than any distant central government ever could.
The text even highlights that slogan. Think globally, act locally. It really captures this idea that global problems need local engagement and solutions.
It does.
So we've got these powerful global forces pushing for integration. But at the same time, you have these equally powerful local forces pushing for autonomy.
Exactly.
It's this intricate dance between the global and the local.
And that's where this idea of globalization comes in. It recognizes that the global and the local aren't opposites. They're interconnected, constantly shaping and influencing each other.
So we've laid out some of the key ideas here. But I'm curious, how does this play out in the real world?
Well, let's look at a few concrete examples.
Okay, perfect.
Let's start with India.
Okay.
The fact that India chose a federal system after independence with power distributed among states is a prime example of multi-level governance in action. It recognizes the diversity of this nation and the need for decision-making to happen at multiple levels.
That's a great example.
Yeah.
And it's not just a historical footnote.
No, it's not.
These federal dynamics are constantly at play in India, influencing everything.
From economic policy to social welfare programs.
Absolutely. And if we look beyond India, we see similar trends in countries like Spain and France, both of which have devolved significant powers to regional bodies in recent decades. It's a recognition of the importance of local identities, languages, and cultures, and a response to those centrifugal forces within their own borders.
Even the UK, which has this long tradition of centralized power, has been undergoing devolution.
It has.
Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland now all have varying degrees of autonomy. It makes you realize that even seemingly unified nation states are having to adapt to these multi-level dynamics.
Precisely. And then, of course, we have the European Union, which our text calls the ultimate case study of multi-level governance. It's this incredibly complex web of interactions.
It does make your head spin a bit. It does.
But I guess that's the point.
That's the point.
It's about embracing this complexity and recognizing that power isn't concentrated in one place anymore.
Exactly.
It's constantly shifting and being negotiated across different levels.
Exactly. And one of the most fascinating examples of this in the EU is how local authorities are increasingly bypassing national governments and working directly with Brussels on issues like economic development or infrastructure projects.
It's a real shift in power dynamics.
It is.
It's like the local level is reaching out to the global level, bypassing the national level altogether.
It is.
And then you have this idea of Europe, of the regions, where regional bodies are gaining influence and resources through EU funding.
Exactly.
Often sidelining national governments in the process. So it's not just that power is being sucked up and drawn down. It's also being redistributed horizontally, with regions gaining more clout.
Exactly. It's a truly multidimensional process. And it highlights how this creates both opportunities and challenges. Power becomes more fluid and dynamic, constantly shifting and adapting.
So this is where it gets relevant for everyone listening. Even if you're not planning on taking the UPSC exams, this intricate web of governance affects all of our lives.
Think about international trade agreements that can affect the price of goods you buy, or environmental regulations that can impact the air you breathe. Even things like zoning laws or local school board decisions are all part of this system. Understanding how it all works is really crucial for anyone who wants to be an informed and engaged citizen in the 21st century.
And that's just the tip of the iceberg.
It is.
There's so much more to explore. So stay tuned for part 2 of our deep dive into multi-level governance. We'll unpack even more examples of how this concept is shaping the world around us.
Sounds good.
Welcome back, everyone.
Yeah.
We're really getting into it now, exploring how this whole idea of multi-level governance is really changing the game.
Yeah.
In terms of how decisions are made and how power operates in our world.
Yeah.
Before we went off, we were discussing how this concept is shaking up the political landscape.
Right.
And how power dynamics aren't just concentrated at the national level anymore.
Right.
It's being exercised at multiple levels.
Exactly.
From the global all the way down to the local.
Yeah.
And we were looking at how the European Union is such a prime example of this interplay, this web of interactions between various levels of government.
Absolutely.
It's a lot to wrap your head around.
It is.
But incredibly important to understand.
It is complex.
Yeah.
But that complexity reflects the reality of how we govern in the 21st century.
So if we acknowledge that multi-level governance is the new normal, what does that mean for how we approach policy making?
Right.
How do we even begin to navigate this web of actors and interests?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And there's no simple answer.
Right.
One thing that is clear, though, is that the old command and control style of government is becoming less and less effective.
Okay.
We need more collaborative approaches,
Okay.
more flexible and adaptable approaches,
Right.
ones that respond to this dynamic nature.
Yeah, the source material talks about how governments are shifting from rowing to steering.
Right.
It sounds intriguing.
It does.
But what does that actually mean?
It means that governments can't do everything themselves anymore.
Okay.
Instead of just directly administering and delivering all these services, they're increasingly focusing on setting those strategic objectives, coordinating different efforts, and creating an environment where other actors can come in and play their part.
So instead of being the all-powerful captain of the ship, they're becoming more like skilled navigators.
That's a great analogy.
Charting the course and working with different stakeholders to reach the destination.
Yeah, and this shift is happening in a few different ways.
Okay.
We're seeing a rise in public-private partnerships.
Okay.
Where governments team up with businesses or nonprofit organizations to deliver services or implement projects.
Right.
It's acknowledging that each sector has strengths.
Right. We're also seeing the lines blurring between the public and private sectors more and more.
Yeah.
Governments are adopting private sector management techniques, outsourcing services, and even engaging in full-scale privatization.
Exactly.
In some cases.
It's all part of this.
It is.
To find better ways to govern.
Right.
In a complex world.
And let's not forget about the role of networks.
Right.
Governments are increasingly relying on these networks of different actors, think tanks, advocacy groups,
research institutions, even citizen-led initiatives, to provide that expertise and gather information.
It's like it takes a village.
Yeah.
Except it takes a whole network of actors operating at multiple levels to tackle these complex challenges we face today.
It does.
Poverty, inequality, climate change.
Yeah. And this brings us back to that question we posed earlier.
Yeah.
If power is more diffused and decision-making is more collaborative, how can individuals and communities make their voices heard in this intricate web?
It seems like it'd be easy to feel powerless.
It does.
Amidst all these forces that are shaping our lives.
But the text actually suggests the opposite. That local action might be more important than ever in influencing global outcomes.
So while decisions might be made at higher levels, their impact is often felt most acutely at the local level.
Right. And that's where communities can mobilize, advocate for their interests, and hold decision makers accountable, even on the international stage.
So even though the world is becoming more interconnected and complex, the power of local action isn't diminished.
It's not. It might even be amplified in this new context.
Interesting.
It's important to remember that multi-level governance doesn't mean that power is evenly distributed or that everyone has an equal voice. But it does create new avenues for different actors, including individuals and communities, to engage in the process and shape those decisions that affect their lives.
Yeah, it's not just about understanding those international treaties and the workings of global institutions.
Exactly.
It's also about recognizing this dynamic interplay between the global, the regional, and the local, and finding those points of leverage where you can create change.
It is. And it's about recognizing that governance isn't static.
Right.
It's dynamic, it's multifaceted, and it's constantly evolving.
Right.
The key is to be informed, engaged, and adaptable.
This conversation has been really insightful.
It has.
I feel like we've only scratched the surface.
We have.
But I hope it's given our listeners a better understanding of how this is shaping the world around us.
Me too. And it's important to remember this isn't just an academic exercise.
Right.
This is about real people.
Yeah.
Real lives. And the future that we're building together.
So true. But before we wrap up completely, there's one more key aspect we need to address.
Okay.
And that's the European Union.
Right.
It's such a fascinating and relevant example of this concept in action.
The EU is really like a microcosm of multi-level governance.
Right.
It showcases the potential and some of those challenges that it presents.
We'll dive deeper into that next time in part 3 of our deep dive.
That's good.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive, everyone. We've been going pretty deep on this concept of multi-level governance and really how it is kind of changing the way decisions are made in this century.
Yeah, it's changing everything.
We've seen how policymaking is being, kind of sucked up to these global and regional levels.
Right.
But also drawn down to the local, creating this dynamic interplay of forces.
It's a puzzle.
It's a puzzle.
Yeah.
It's definitely complex, but
it is.
understanding it is so crucial.
Yeah.
For anyone who wants to
absolutely
grasp how international relations work.
Yeah.
Especially those of you prepping for the UPSC exams.
Right.
This isn't just theoretical.
No.
This is about
it's the real world.
Real world politics.
Yeah.
Power.
How power operates.
In our increasingly interconnected world.
Exactly. And one of the best ways to really grasp this is to look at a real world case study.
Okay.
And the European Union offers a really fascinating and relevant example.
Yeah, the EU is like this.
It's like a microcosm of multi-level governance in action.
With this interplay between the local, the regional,
the national,
and the supranational.
It's a great example of both the potential and the challenges that come with this new way of governing.
On the one hand, the EU has achieved some remarkable things.
Yeah.
Think about the economic integration, the cooperation between member states, the progress it's made on these transnational challenges.
It's remarkable when you think about the history of Europe, centuries of conflict.
Right.
The EU has been so instrumental in creating this period of peace and prosperity.
Absolutely. But on the other hand, the EU has faced criticism. Some argue that it's become too bureaucratic, too undemocratic, too distant from the concerns of everyday people.
You hear about this democratic deficit in the EU, where decisions are being made by unelected bureaucrats in Brussels, seemingly out of touch with the people.
Out of touch.
Yeah.
This highlights one of the key challenges, I think, of multi-level governance.
It does.
Finding that balance between efficiency and accountability.
How do you ensure that decisions are made effectively in a coordinated way, but also that they're responsive to the needs of the people?
It's a delicate balancing act.
It is.
It's not unique to the EU.
No.
You see it in federal systems.
All over the world.
All over the world.
Yeah, including India.
How much power should be with the central government?
Right.
How much should be with the states?
These are questions that policymakers deal with constantly.
Constantly.
Yeah.
And there's no easy answer.
Nope.
So for those UPSC aspirants out there, this is a key takeaway.
It is.
Don't look for simple solutions or one-size-fits-all models.
Right.
Develop that ability to analyze complex situations.
Understand the different perspectives, the different interests involved.
And come up with solutions that address the specific challenges.
Exactly. And it's not just for aspiring diplomats or policymakers.
Right.
It's for all of us as citizens trying to navigate this complex and changing world.
This deep dive has been so insightful.
It has. We've covered a lot.
We've covered
from the theoretical to the real world challenges and opportunities.
We've seen how multi-level governance is changing the game, redistributing power,
creating new avenues for participation,
more collaborative approaches to problem solving.
But we've also seen how it can lead to tension, especially when it comes to accountability and democratic representation.
So as we wrap up,
I
want to leave our listeners with a final question.
Okay.
In this web of governance, how can we make sure that people's voices are heard?
Right.
And their interests are represented?
How do we prevent it from just becoming another layer of bureaucracy that's distant?
Unresponsive to the needs of the people.
That's such a crucial question.
Yeah.
And one I hope our listeners will keep thinking about.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that this isn't just an abstract concept.
Right.
It's about real people.
Yeah.
Real lives.
It is.
And the future we're building together.
Well said. If you enjoyed this deep dive into multi-level governance,
yeah,
be sure to like and subscribe to our channel.
Absolutely.
For more insightful discussions.
Yeah, we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening, and until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep asking those tough questions.